Everyone, this is lecture 12.1. Here we're talking about preventing poverty. So in preventing poverty, we mean what we can do for kids to make sure that if they are poor now, how can we help them grow up to not be poor? That's basically the gist of the whole thing. So first we're going to talk about why kids matter, which may seem kind of obvious, but there's some unobvious things in there too. Then we'll talk about how social settings can impact kids and problems that occur when we are trying to help children. So there are many reasons why we want to minimize childhood poverty. First of all, we don't want kids to suffer because they're cute and people empathize with children, right? We've all been kids, but we haven't all been old, right? We have a hard time empathizing with people that we are not a part of, but everyone does have memories of their childhood. And for that reason, most people, even if they don't want kids, even if they don't have kids, they can at least empathize with kids in some way. However, there are some really practical reasons to care about what happens to children too. Our ability to operate and function as adults is absolutely dependent on the stability of our childhoods. So if our childhood is unstable, if there's a lot of stress there, if there's a lot of trauma there, it can impact our ability to successfully use language. It can impact our intellectual or physical development. It can also impact our ability to empathize with others, and our social development as well. Now, obviously, if you know some about psychology, childhood development, all that, you can put your finger on which of those disorders I'm talking about. But across the board, kind of a non-dependent on disorder, an environment that is traumatic and unstable for children absolutely can cause them to not be functioning adults, is the gist of it. And these ideas are backed up by a pretty old idea called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow states that higher levels of functions occur only when lower level functions are met. Now, this is by no means a perfect set of theory, as most sets of theory can find some flaws in it. But it is a pretty good model for helping kids in general and helping broad groups of humanity. So first of all, we have our physiological needs. These are things like food, water, for most people, sex, all that stuff. Our physical stuff we have to do. That's at the bottom. If you can't take care of that stuff, you can't take care of anything else. Then we have safety. So we talk about, does our body feel safe? Are we not afraid of being fired? Does our family feel safe, etc. Then, after we have those two, we can start to feel love and belonging, right? So with those components, you can't make friends if you feel you're in danger or you're physically in danger, right? After you have friends, you can develop self-esteem and confidence, and then after all that stuff, then we can get to the self-actualization phase, and we can really be like everything we can possibly be. So, economic well-being of children should be a top priority if we want to have a stable and functioning society in the future. Unfortunately, many people who make decisions in our society are not oriented on helping people in the future. They're oriented on helping people that basically influence them. Additionally, a lot of those same people don't really take social sciences into consideration when they're making decisions, etc., etc. However, since single-parent families do have a higher risk of falling into poverty, we really, if we want to help the most people possible, place a greater emphasis on helping single-parent families. And additionally then, if we look at the current laws and policies that are in place, unfortunately, many of them punish single-parent families with domestic policy that gives preference to nuclear families. What does that mean? That means that Unfortunately, the system as it is in place today is geared to help families that are made up of mom, dad, and a couple kids. But if your family unit is something other than that, it might not be able to help you, or it might not be designed to help you. Now, when helping children, it is critical to remember that not everyone comes from the same family, so the policies that are in place don't really work all that well, especially in a modern family situation. This absolutely makes sense, but unless it's pointed out, most people assume everyone had childhoods that were similar to them. It's kind of a faulty function in our brains, right? We assume, well, these are people I can relate to, so they must have had experiences like me. Well, in reality, most people had pretty heavy variations on childhood compared to other people. Even if you grow up in the same community as someone, but your racial identity may be different, that's a different lived experience. Even if your parents only had one kid, but your parents' siblings, your cousins, had like 8 kids, those also are very different childhood settings. Additionally, our family of origin may be very different from our parents' family of origin. Let's throw out some terms here. Family of origin means the family you grew up in, and unfortunately, this is a bit of a dated term, but it's helpful when talking about people who go out and have kids of their own. That family is called the family of procreation. This is a new group of 2 or more people that then have kids. That's so. I have 2 children. My family of origin were my mom, my dad, me, and my brother. But my family of procreation is me, my wife, and our kids, right? That term can loosely be applied to people without children, but it's, like I said, it's a dated term. It's not perfect. I'm sure there are family experts that have better terms. I just unfortunately don't off the top of my head. So what? Well, let's imagine this kid at the top grew up in the 90s, and he is now that dad on the bottom. And just imagine the childhood that was given to him by these 2 very well-intended hair metal fans in the 90s, and then what his family may be looking like and doing now today, and those are probably pretty different scenarios. And additionally, then this can be somewhat helpful in understanding our parents, and if you have children, your children in the future. Let's throw some more terms out there. So a nuclear family, as I laid out there, mom, dad, who have kids. This was the dominant type of family in the mid 20th century. This is what we think of often as classic Americana. Now, it should be pointed out that families with same-sex parents are potentially different than nuclear families. So let's say you have 2 parents in a same-sex family, or some variant on a queer family, and they have kids. Well, we are unsure as sociologists yet whether nuclear families and this kind of new version of a nuclear family, whether they operate and interact with society in the same ways, if that makes sense. There are many ways that they obviously do. There are a few ways that they may be different, but because same-sex marriage was only federally recognized in the United States since 2013, there are some areas where sociologists aren't quite sure entirely. We have not had fully grown adults yet whose parents, from the time they were born, these same-sex parents have been their parents their whole life. And until we see those kids being fully grown within the legal structure, we can't be entirely sure. So it's gonna be a couple years. Additionally, extended families are the family in which 3 or more generations live in the same house or close proximity. So when sociologists and anthropologists talk about extended families, we are talking about a living unit, a living situation. I have a very large family in terms of my dad's brothers and sisters and their kids, but in this context, I do not have an extended family, which is maybe what we would call my family in our common English language. But in terms of social science, I don't have an extended family. Those people, including my Aunt Kim, my cousin Cassie, my cousin Heather, those are kin in anthropological terms. The benefits, though, of living in an extended family situation, let's say you're a grown person, you live with your parents and your kids also live with you, well, it's a lot more cost effective than a nuclear family living situation actually is. Let's say your parents have already paid off that house, right? Well, you can live in that house rent free if you live as a family economic unit. It has built-in babysitters. It has built-in care for older people. All of those elements can be tremendously expensive and um, really was and can be and has been a very helpful living situation for many people if their family dynamic can work that way. Often, younger generations are criticized for not having moved out of their parents' house, of not getting out and away. But what we may actually be seeing is a shift from um, nuclear family living situations, which only really became common in the United States after World War II. We may be seeing a shift from that to the extended family situation again, which was what was common in the United States at the beginning of the 1900s, right? So what we actually could be seeing is a shift back to a previous way of living when everyone lived on the farm. Again, this is one of those areas of change that's very interesting in our society. Blended families, then. This term can be used to describe a family made up of parents and children from previous relationships, and often when we talk about that, we're talking about relationships after divorces. It was once thought that living in this situation could be harmful to children due to a perceived lack of stability. This fear was especially common in the late 80s and early 90s when a lot of families were and couples were getting divorced because divorce laws changed in a way that made it more feasible. It was thought that maybe those kids were going to grow up with a degree of trauma that they couldn't really take. Now that those kids have grown and had their lived experience and many of them have made their own families of procreation, we've seen that actually those kids of blended family living situations are better able to adapt to different social situations. Another way to put it, if your roommate grew up in a blended family, they're probably going to be a lot better of a roommate than a family that stayed together through the whole time, which maybe is counterintuitive, but that's what the social science tells us. And I'm not encouraging anyone to get divorced just so that their kids are better roommates, by the way. Just want to point that out. So, kinship care. This is another term that we can use, especially when talking about families that are having some problems. Kinship care refers to children that are being cared for, that are being raised by either their grandparents or other non-parental kin. So maybe you are raising your nephew, or maybe you're raising a cousin's kid even, or grandparents are raising kids. That is the definition of kinship care. Usually, kinship care occurs in when there is a situation that's not good, right? Kinship care is a model that has really developed in the last, let's say 30 years or so in the United States as a way of helping out the really strained foster care system. So it has been found that when kids can go live with at least a family member that they know, if their parents are unable to take care of them, then that situation is dramatically healthier on average than when they are put into foster care or some other way that is much more different than how they grew up, as opposed to a family member that if they raise them is only kind of different, right? It's all about minimizing that trauma. Now let's talk about how social settings can impact children. So a social setting is incredibly influential on who you actually grow up to be. This is especially true for children as childhood experiences are much more impactful in the long term. Education has a huge influence on children. By virtue of being in college, many people go directly from college to from high school to college. And if you're one of those people, you've spent most of your life in education settings as it is right now. So you can just think about all of the ways that you've been shaped by being in school, right? Now, unfortunately, variables of education are very closely tied to wealth and poverty. It creates a very, very vicious cycle. So poverty, uh, low income tax, right? We talked about this already. That income tax funds schools in the United States. If you're in an area with low property values, then that's a small amount of money, that percentage, that goes to fund the schools. So poverty causes bad schools keep people from escaping poverty, and then poverty creates bad schools, etc. Right? So kids become unable to escape cycles of poverty, unfortunately, because additionally, if we look at education on the macro level, richer children tend to get better educations than poorer children. And the richer the family is, the better the education. Obviously, private schools do play a part to play in this because private schools typically can ask for a lot more money from actually parents as opposed to tax structures, so they have more resources to deal with. However, public schools in higher income areas also seem to have this advantage. The reason for that is because those public schools, with their higher amounts of money pulled from income tax, are able to spend resources in ways that are very similar to private schools. The most obvious reason for education inequality in the United States, then, is that approach to school funding. Elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools, by being funded by property taxes, then a sociologist would point out, is a tremendous way to create social reproduction of class in our country. Well, and of course, a big reason for this is that there is no federal property tax guidelines to fund schools in the United States. So schools being paid by state and local funds result in areas that are rich having better schools. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little redundant on this, but I just want to lay the whole thing out, right? So it's unequal on the whole country level, it's unequal on the state level, and then it's also then unequal down to the county level and sometimes even the municipal level. So we see even within the same state, areas that are incredibly poor, in this map being the light pink areas, compared to areas that are incredibly wealthy, those being the dark red areas. And then on this map of Pennsylvania, we see in the Pittsburgh area, there are spots of very light pink. Those are the poor counties. And then you see spots of very poor light pink on the eastern side too, in more the Philadelphia area. Those are also very poor areas. And obviously, this is a matter of resources. If the school has more resources and better funding, they can have newer buildings, better technology, better labs, shops, classes, AP classes, extracurriculars, etc. If you have a school that has a ski club or a horse team, chances are you have a school that is really well funded. On the flip side of that, if the only thing your school has is a chess team or basketball, those extracurriculars tend to be lower rent, if you will. You don't have to pay as much to be part of those things because really all you need is some relatively simple equipment. Now let's talk a bit about physical environment. Those in high poverty areas and non-white areas, are more likely to be exposed to toxic pollutants. This is a matter of what we call environmental sociology, and I do teach a course on environmental justice. I think it's a really good course in which we talk about all of these ways that the way social inequality, social injustice is replicated in the physical environment we create on our planet. So if that's something that really interests you and the next couple slides interest you, I encourage you to check out my environmental justice class. So one example of this would be the Flint water crisis, which occurred in Flint, Michigan in the 20 teens and is continuing to this day. And it probably will continue for the foreseeable future because of kind of the way it's been handled, unfortunately. It should be pointed out, from the 40s to the 1980s, Flint was a really great place to live. And the reason it was a really great place to live is because the General Motors auto plants were in those areas and provided a lot of very good middle-class jobs. If you're really interested in that bit, I would encourage you to check out a documentary by Michael Moore called Roger and Me. However, in 2014, after decades of decline as a municipality, Flint switched its water source from the Detroit water system to the Flint River in a cost-setting measure. This made the water in Flint not only undrinkable, but actually hazardous to the skin. So basically how it went down is the city of Flint found that they would save a couple $1,000s by pooling water directly out of the Flint River and just having that be the tap water. Well, there are two major problems there and so many minor problems. The first is the Flint River is incredibly polluted because of those auto plants that used to be there. The second of all is that the pipes that go from the Flint River into people's houses, because they are so old, many of them are lead pipes. So the water not only is exposed to being a polluted river water, it's then basically run through a lead reverse filtration system, if you will, to make the water even more dangerous. And the water is incredibly bad. It's not just dirty, it is stinky, it has a high lead content, and not only is it not safe to drink, it's not safe to let it get on your skin. So not only do you not have water to drink, you don't have water to cook with, you can't even bathe with this water. That is an incredibly bad situation. Additionally, after the crisis started, blood lead levels in Flint's children were 2 to 3 times higher than the acceptable level, putting at least 30,000 children at risk of lead poisoning and lead exposure. Now, lead poisoning is bad for adults. It can damage our hearts, our kidneys, all sorts of other systems. But the reason why lead exposure is especially dangerous for children is because lead poisoning inhibits development and growth in body systems. So kids who are exposed to dangerous levels of lead may be stunted in terms of growth, They may be stunted in terms of intellectual development. They could have nerve and kidney damage throughout their lives, so they could be in kind of continuing pain to the point of a potential lifelong disability because of this lead that was in their drinking water. By 2018, activist groups were able to make the crisis a political matter on the national level, and there has been some progress made in terms of compensation to help people in Flint with this bad water, but the water itself coming out of the taps is still bad. Those people who have gotten government funding, basically the short of it is the most people can get is water delivered to their house in like water coolers, and that's pretty much it. Maybe some filters so that they can actually shower, but it's still a very, very bad situation. Another example, urban slums. This is a very much a global phenomena, and people in poverty globally tend to be forced to live in tightly packed living conditions, especially in urban areas. Obviously, living in tightly packed living conditions in rural areas is not an issue, but in cities where there tend to be more opportunities, if you don't have money, you can live in situations that are way, way, way too crowded. Now, aside from personal preference, living in a crowded area can be very dangerous in terms of things like disease, things like COVID, obviously, but also more parasitic diseases such as lice and scabies. If there's little bugs on your body and you live pretty close to other people, those little bugs are going to be able to jump to other people and contaminate them. Additionally, if those living situations and if those apartments don't have great ventilation systems, then diseases like meningitis can spread really dangerously. And I believe meningitis is one of the things that college students are pretty routinely inoculated for. So you probably have already had that shot, but a lot of the people in those living places haven't. Another example are urban heat waves that can be incredibly dangerous. The first very modern one of these was the 1995 Chicago heat wave that killed 739 people across Chicago over a span of 10 days. Unfortunately, the dead were disproportionately elderly and black. Well, so what? Well, elderly populations and black populations are disproportionately poor, and if you break it out even more, Chicago at that time, and still does, had these huge skyscrapers that were designated as lower income housing, basically, right? So this is basically where people who needed help were put to live. That's government assisted housing, and unfortunately those places often didn't have air conditioning, often didn't have proper ventilation, etc. And because of that, basically what was happening is people were baking to death in these intensely, intensely too hot rooms that they were living in. This is a phenomena that has reoccurred over the years. This is just the worst it's been in the United States. Unfortunately, because of climate change, we're probably going to see more of this in the poorest areas of cities, in those areas that can't afford to keep their air conditioning on. And it's really becoming a very pressing problem that is going to need solutions. This isn't just something that happened once in 1995. This is something we're going to see become more and more common, unfortunately. As I alluded to, many of the dead lived in the very tall housing projects, and those projects were overwhelmingly black because of structural racism. The survivors described those apartments as being oven-like with no air conditioning, and the windows didn't open. Forgot to mention that part. So let's talk about the problems kids have that can actually become the things that 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 hold them back in their lives. Safety net programs are designed for nuclear families due to perceptions of politicians and the development of the system during the heyday of the nuclear family. What does that mean? Well, that means that the systems that are in place were designed for family structures that are not as common as they once were. So if you are not living in a two-parent household, basically in the middle class, the structure is not designed to help you. In families that are not nuclear families, child support and its enforcement is becoming an increasingly uh, uh, hazardous concern. The reason there being that female-headed households with children are at significant risk of poverty. These family standards of living tend to fall between 23 and 40% within the year following divorce. What does that mean? That means after a single parent gets divorced and she's given full custody of her children, not only does that person have to care for those children, but also the income that they get falls pretty dramatically due to having to call off more days at work, maybe losing that second job, and then also if child support is not paid, losing the income from that second parent. So there are two reasons there being that I kind of already said, is women are more likely to be granted full custody, and failure of non-custodial parents to pay child support, whether they are male or not, really creates very bad situations, not only for that single parent, but also the children as well. In 2015, 43.5% of custodial parents, and 80% of those were mothers, received the full amount of court-ordered child payments. So 25.8% of parents received partial payments, and 30% of those 30% received no payments. So under half of custodial parents, under half of people who owe their child support actually pay child support. This means that $33.7 billion of money that should be going to custodial parents is getting there, but only 20 billion was received. So effectively, it's more clearly stated in those parentheses, and I should have just read it off like that. Only 60% of child support money actually got to where it should have got in 2015, and these numbers are a little old, but there's no reason to believe that that's any different today. Among custodial parents below poverty who were receiving full payments, the mean annual support received was about $5,000 and represents over 58% of their mean annual income. So that means that these were people that their total income for the year in raising kids is somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000, and that is a small amount of money if you're not really paying your own bills yet. And that 5,000 out of the 12,000 is a huge percentage of the money they have to work with. Additionally, child support enforcement was of particular interest to the 1996 welfare reform laws, but instead of actually fixing these laws, they had more of the effect of stigmatizing people who pay child support. One way that you could try to fix this, which was laid out by Erwin Garfinkel, a sociologist, is to create a child support assurance program. What this would mean is that non-custodial parents would pay a set percentage of their income for child support, and those support payments would be automatically withheld from the non-custodial parent's paycheck, right? So thus, in the same manner that Social Security payments are. Where money gets held up in a lot of areas of the economy is people actually having to pay the bill, right? So if we had a mechanism to set up that money was automatically required by law, no matter what, to be pooled from the paycheck of that individual, then we would be able to make sure that 100% or at least a lot of that child support money got to where it had to be put. And a revamped child support system would then mean that all children were guaranteed the amount of money that the courts have found were necessary to maintain those children's standard of living, and that they would not suffer kind of the shock and the trauma of a change in lifestyle. This would apply to all parents who father or mother a child, regardless of whether they're married or not. As it exists, it's a lot easier to avoid child support if you're not married. These systems are often accused of being unfair by fathers, and that is a fair assertion. However, agencies may have a tendency to become hostile toward fathers by default, because if a lot of fathers, or at least a perceived number of a lot of fathers, are actually hostile to the system, they could kind of easily by default become hostile toward all fathers no matter what. It's ugly, but it's an easy trap to fall into. And although the vast majority of women have custody of their children, if a father has custody, then it would be the mother who would be paying child support out of the paycheck. So this isn't a thing that would only go one way on sex or gender lines. It would go equally. It is simply a matter of who has custody versus who doesn't have custody. And this then would allow us possibly to fix that discrepancy of custodial fathers not necessarily being able to get the resources they want to. Because once the system is set up in a way that actually works, we can then set up that adjacent problem of fathers in certain situations not getting a fair shake. Quality childcare is also a tremendous problem in this area. Childcare is tremendously expensive. I just recently was able to stop paying for childcare because my youngest kid just went into kindergarten, and it is a huge amount of money. It was in my paycheck. Basically, the way my family's set up is that I pay the childcare, and about 50% of my monthly income every single month went into paying childcare. If I made maybe 10% less, it probably wouldn't make sense for me to even work. I was a stay-at-home parent for a while. Anyway, you can tell I can get soapboxy on this one. Poor households pay about 30% of their income to childcare. So if someone makes $310 per week, they could pay $93 in childcare. And that is just it's not feasible economically. And you can't just leave kids alone. You can't just not pay for childcare. It's actually easier to not pay your electricity bill than to not pay for childcare, because kids can't be left alone the way a lot of them were when I was a kid, and that was a dangerous situation too. It's not something we can just put off. We do have to actually try to fix this one. Additionally, childcare is often inaccessible for low-income parents. Poor households pay 30% of their I already said that. Childcare centers are often not open when working single parents need to have them. So this means that there are very real situations where a parent who works nights has to put their kids to bed and then sneak out and lock the doors behind them and hope that everything's okay till morning. And I can tell you, as a parent, the idea of that is really, really, really scary, but that's what desperation creates. If you're lucky and you're a night shift worker, single parent, you might be able to find a childcare that does overnight work, but that's really hard to find. And it should be remembered that childcare is a relatively new phenomenon. Prior to second wave feminism, taking care of children was absolutely seen as being the duty of women. And when it became more common for women to actually work, this need for childcare emerged. So it's always difficult for society to deal with new structural changes, especially those surrounding children and the family. But if the system had actually been fixed in the first place, it should be working by now, is what I'm trying to get at. We're almost 40 years after this phenomena started, and there still isn't a childcare system that functions in our society. We could try to fix this by putting greater subsidies to provide child support to a family in childcare programs. As the current system is set up, many children are not in childcare programs. But if we increased it with federal funding, we could put together a good quality education that could include all families. It could expand hours into the early morning. It could go later into the afternoon or at night. It could eliminate unneeded part-day programs. There are a lot of programs that sort of function. They basically serve the purpose of allowing a stay-at-home parent to get a couple hours break, but is by no means functional for part-time workers or especially full-time workers. There's just so many elements of this aspect of parenting that just don't work. Additionally, teen pregnancy is an issue in this area, but it's actually far less of an issue that we actually perceive it to be. Having a child at an early age and out of wedlock does significantly increase the risk of poverty for both the mother and the child, but teen births have actually decreased dramatically over the last 30 years. In 1960, what was it? Birth rates per 10,000. So what we have, 1,000. So what we have here is in 1960, there were 89 births per 1,000 teens. And then in 2018, there were only 17 births. And then additionally, since 1991, the birth rate has fallen by an additional 71%. So teen pregnancy is not something that is getting worse. It actually has gotten dramatically better, but we could still do better. When we compare it to other industrialized countries, we still do have a relatively high teen birth rate, and a big portion of that can actually be attributed to abstinence-only sex ed programs. A lot of teen mothers report that they simply didn't know that they could get pregnant in the way that they had sex, and that is something that is almost immediately dispelled when you have a functioning sex ed. We could provide medically comprehensive education regarding sexual education. That would be a big fix. Abstinence-only education does not work, and I just stated again, abstinence-only education does not work. It is actually linked to increased pregnancy and increased STI and STD rates. These education programs that encourage people to never have sex no matter what when they're teens, they are based on folk morality. They are not based on social science. They are not based on evidence. They are just based on what people think sounds good and what people think is moral. When you actually teach kids how sex works, how to have safe sex, and how pregnancy goes, but acknowledging that they're going to have sex, or at least a big percentage of them are, then we can actually have those programs preventing the pregnancies and the diseases that are associated there. Additionally, if we provide access to contraception and family planning services, we can significantly reduce the risk of teen pregnancy. And this information can be provided either directly by schools or by outside organizations. Planned Parenthood has done a tremendous job in terms of being able to do education in addition to providing health care for people who need it. And the key, though, regardless of whether an agency like Planned Parenthood's involved or whether whoever's involved, The key is to be medically accurate in this education. Almost, if you could really, instead of teaching it like a health class, maybe teach it like a science class, right? The key is to not get political about it, to not get religious about it, just to provide the medical information. And if we do that, we will be able to lower those teen pregnancies and those teen STI infection rates to where it is in the rest of the world. With all of that said, our rates are still too high, but they are not growing. That's a really common misconception. It has gotten a lot better over time. Additionally, we need to create social settings where teens are encouraged to avoid pregnancy. And let me lay the why. Why would a teen seek pregnancy? Well, it's not uncommon in certain cultures for childbearing to be seen as one of the actual symbols of prestige. So if you're in a poor area, if you live among a lot of poor people, it is not outrageous for people to assert that, well, it's great to be a mother, and mothers are great, and I want to be a mother, so I'm going to start having children really young. Well, we need to provide people, young men, yes, but especially young women, and all young people, with role models in education, in employment, etc., so that they see, yes, of course, motherhood is good, but there are things you can do other than motherhood to bring you prestige in life. And there are opportunities that you could have. And by providing that, that is another way to keep teenagers from getting pregnant. And then additionally, it should absolutely be shown that media does bombard teens with sexual images. And yeah, that absolutely does involve pornography on the internet. But it's not as much, it's some that those images are there in the first place. But the bigger driving force is that a lot of young people don't realize that those images they are seeing are fantasy, that even most all pornography it's a fantasy, it's an image, it doesn't reflect all elements of human reproduction, right? As a result of that, the only education a lot of people are getting is on free porn sites, and that's really broken. We need to teach our kids about sex a lot better than we actually do, and it is very much a matter of their future and their safety. Okay, this was a pretty long one. I'm sorry if I was a little bit scatterbrained, but I think I got all the information in there. If you need any help, just let me know, and we're getting close to the end, I promise.